When Nathan was 16 years old, his Mennonite church group from Kansas went on a mission trip to Appalachia. They were a bunch of farm kids who were experienced with a hammer and a circular saw, and so they knew what to do. They knew how to work hard, how to get it done, and that's what they did. They were given a job, and they got on it. Well, years later, as an adult, Nathan learned something that the students had not been aware of when they'd been on that mission trip. That the leaders of his youth group had been told by the service project directors there in Appalachia that they had never had a group of youth eat as much as that group ate. In fact, so much so that the service project directors were considering limiting how much each child could have because they were running out. But they also decided that they had never had a group work as hard or accomplish as much as that group of youth. And so in the end, they bought more food and just kept feeding them. Nathan connects that experience to the mindset that he says was ingrained in him throughout his upbringing, and it is what you see on the screen. Work hard, receive reward, repeat. That's what you do in life. And that doesn't sound like a bad notion at all. On this Labor Day weekend, we celebrate that as an essential American story, right? You don't get anything without working for it. You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. An honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Nothing in life is free. And we love this story, and we find value in this story. Early 20th century sociologist Max Weber coined the term the Protestant work ethic. He coined that term as part of his thinking and writing about the birth of our form of capitalism, and he connected that Protestant work ethic to our form of capitalism. Work hard, make money, buy the stuff you need and want, take care of yourself and your own, and repeat the cycle. And this is empowering. It defines us, and for so many Americans, their job is their identity, and it is their source of self-worth, too. But there are problems with this story. There are problems with this story. For the stay-at-home mom, for the retiree, for someone whose disability prohibits traditional work, for someone who is quite simply dissatisfied and finding no reward in their job. This ethic of being defined by employment and earning can be disorienting for people who don't fit it. And for the hard worker who works too many hours and never uses up vacation days and thereby alienates family, this story is a losing game. Today we're on the second of 4 weeks in our Back to School Survival Guide series. So you may be wondering, what in the world does Nathan's story about working hard, receiving reward, and repeating have to do with going back to school? Well, of course, that's basically what students and teachers must do from August until June now. There's really only 1 month of the year that you don't go to public school in Texas. It's an expectation that children need to learn from preschool onward in order to be successful in our educational system and later as adults to be successful in our workforce. But from a theological perspective, there's a real problem with this thinking. It completely lacks something that is essential to our Christian faith. That work hard, get reward, repeat ethic lacks any sense of God's grace. Maybe you know the parable that Jesus tells about the workers in the vineyard. It's in Matthew 20. And the gist of that parable is that whether you are the person who shows up early on the job and labors all day long, or you are the person who shows up when it's just about closing time, you get paid the same amount. That's what happens in that parable. Jesus is a real meddler when he tells stories like this, isn't he? I mean, this is problematic for us. This causes us trouble. This doesn't fit with our Protestant work ethic or our sense of what is just and right. But that story is absolutely in keeping with the ways of God toward God's people from the earliest biblical narratives. Take, for example, the story we read today in Exodus 16. The backstory, and I think we have a slide for this, the backstory is that the Israelites had been wandering in the wilderness for quite a while, since fleeing from slavery in Egypt. And they have grown so weary of basically moving around in the desert like nomads in a large group of people. Most especially, they have been fussing at Moses, their leader, about being hungry. In fact, so much so, they are so hungry and so frustrated that they have even been pining for being back in Egypt, as though it was better for them when they were in slavery because at least their stomachs were satisfied. In response, God has quite literally showered grace upon them. I mean, showered grace upon them in the form of this miraculous bread from heaven. Manna in the morning and quail in the evening, enough for everybody. But the miracle came with user instructions. They were never to gather more than they could eat in one day, or else it would get worms in it and spoil and be bad. Go back and read that. That's why the mention of worms in the part that Gloria read for us. Except that on the sixth day, on that one day of the week, they were to gather double the usual amount needed for the day. And then on the seventh day, they were to gather none. They were to take a rest. They were not to move any further in their journey. They were to rest and enjoy what God had provided for them. Sabbath rest was not a new concept in Exodus 16. It's there in the design of creation. Genesis tells us that God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, and then God rested. God rested. And within God's good creation, almost everything was designed for a rhythm of work and rest. There are seasons for growing and seasons for dormancy in the plant world. There is a pattern of waking and sleeping for nearly every creature that God made. And we ought to catch on to this because we are told that God rested, and each one of us human beings is created in the image of God. And if our Maker needs rest, then certainly must we. And it is one of only two of the 10 Commandments that is stated in the positive. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. When we think of the 10 Commandments, I suspect that many of us, when we first think 10 Commandments, we think in terms of prohibitions, things we're not supposed to do, and punishment, consequences if we break those rules. But if we think of the fourth commandment, the Sabbath rest commandment, in that way, then we're missing the grace in it. This is not about legalism or punishment. It's about a gift of God's grace that's built into the pattern of all creation. So one day Jesus was going somewhere with his disciples, and they were crossing through a grain field. It was the Sabbath day. And as they walked along, they were a little bit hungry, and so they plucked some heads of grain for a snack while they walked through the grain field. Well, some Pharisees saw what was going on, and they criticized Jesus and his disciples for doing this, for working on the Sabbath. That was work, collecting food. Clearly, the Pharisees missed that there is grace intended in this commandment. Well, in response to the Pharisees' criticism, Jesus says an important and beautiful thing. It's in the verse on the screen for you. The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. And that's a really important distinction for us to make. It is not about the rule keeping, but about the grace receiving. This is for us. That's our biblical principle for this week's installation of our Back to School Survival Guide series. But it applies whether you are school-aged or a parent or a retiree or whatever your situation or stage in life. The Sabbath was made for us because we need times to disconnect from the usual demands and to reconnect with God, with family, with friends. And we get wrapped up in that quintessential and in many ways good American story of work hard, receive reward, and repeat. But we get caught up in it as this never-ending cycle, and we forget that God made the Sabbath for us. Rest is a blessed gift that is part of God's design for our lives. Rest is a gift of grace. The marvelous innovations of technology in our time have in so many ways freed us from work compared to generations before us. So we ought to be able to rest more, right? There's technology, there's machines, there's processes to do stuff for us. We ought to be able to rest more. My grandfather, who died a few years ago at age 99, and you know others like him, he saw mind-boggling technological improvements in his lifetime. In his childhood, they washed clothes by hand. His family, to get to town, walked or rode horseback or hitched a wagon. They chopped wood to keep a fire burning in the stove to cook their food. They hand-pumped water, and they occasionally got a radio signal out on the ranch and could hear something about the world beyond. By the end of his life, he had enjoyed the common use of air conditioning and microwaves, and commercial air travel, though he never liked it. He watched old westerns on cable television, and he had his quality of life extended by the technology of knee replacement surgery and quadruple heart bypass. He was irritated by grandkids and great-grandkids being tied up on cell phones and the internet. And that brings us to this week's practical tip for those who are going back to school, but for all of us. Power down. Power down. A phone rang. Thank you, whoever it is. Now nobody's going to hit the mute button. They're afraid to, don't move. Don't move. It's ringing. I know. Gloria, is it yours? No. See, the laughter covered up. Now we didn't notice who reached for their phone, so we're all good. There's grace here too. Okay, where was I? I have no idea. Power down. Set limits on technology use. There is much good in technological advancements. It is a wonderful thing in so many ways. Time saving for some things, communication improving for others, and effort reducing in many ways. But if we are not careful, we can become slaves to it so that our phone rings during church. Or it vibrates in our pocket because we're getting a text message or whatever it is. Being plugged in all of the time fits right in to that ethic of this sort of tireless cycle of working. We may not think that those are the same things, that one is a diversion and one is work. But in the same way that we work for the reward of money or of recognition, we are a society that is prone to getting caught up in the never-ending cycle of defining ourselves, finding our worth and our identity in our digital consumption as well. Whether it's keeping up with the latest trends through Instagram or Pinterest or following celebrities on Twitter or comparing our lives to our so-called friends on Facebook, instantly answering work emails and calls that ding on our smartphones, carrying our favorite Netflix shows or video games with us on our tablet so that any spare minute, any waiting anywhere is filled with this activity. Last week, we looked at Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount about how we can't serve two masters, that we can't serve God and wealth. And the connection, we looked at the connection between that divided loyalty and how it causes anxiety or worry or stress in our lives. Constantly being connected to tech contributes likewise to a divided heart and a divided mind. We cannot stay plugged into entertainment and work all the time and really connect with God and with each other. Children of all ages and adults of all ages, too, need to power down. We need times without tech, with no screens, with no beeps, with nothing digital. Times to disconnect from tech and the related demands that it creates, and to reconnect with God and with people. It's not a punishment. It's not a punishment to unplug. It is a gift. It is a blessing and an opportunity. It is grace. Decide how to make it work for you, depending on your stage in life and the requirements that are placed upon you in your work and otherwise. You've got to decide how to make unplugging work for you and for your household. It could be a time limit on total daily usage of digital devices. It could be that there's a cutoff time, dinner time, or an hour before you start the bedtime routine, whatever that might be. It could be a day of the week where all of the tech is put away. But figure out what's going to work for your house and commit to it. So back to Nathan, that hard-working Mennonite farm kid from Kansas. He's now a dad and a seminary professor. And earlier this year, he published a book about Sabbath keeping for children and youth. In it, he writes about that work hard, receive reward, repeat cycle. And he writes this, and I quote, "If I think about all of this in relation to my children, it shakes me to the core. Sure, I want my children to grow up and know how to work hard. I also want them to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that grace is real." He continues saying, "I want my children to know that who they are cannot be reduced to any work that they can or cannot do. I want them to know that they were loved before they existed. I want them to know that they will always be loved. And I want them to know that love and grace are just part of who they are and part of who God is." End quote. Sabbath was made for us so that we can know that, so that we can experience that love and that grace. We've got to help children and youth and each other as adults to dwell in that story, in that reality, even as we hold that intention with the Americans work hard story. We've got to stop, rest, unplug, and connect with God and with each other on a regular basis. There's no substitute for it. There's no once in a while for it. Tiffany Schlein built her career by being online almost all of the time. She's the creator of the Webby Awards, which honor the best of the web every year. But every Friday evening for nearly a decade, Tiffany and her family have put away their devices and spent 24 hours offline, disconnected. It's what they call a technology Shabbat, a technology Sabbath. It's a modern twist on that ancient commandment. And it's actually a concept that's attracting the attention of millennials and others who are just exhausted with trying to keep up with the fast pace of this digital world. There's some science that supports the idea that this is a good thing, science that can tell you that there are measurable benefits for longevity, for mental and physical health, for unplugging. And I could give you the data and you can go look it up online. But we don't need it. You don't need the data. You don't need me to give you statistics to prove to you that this is a good and right thing. I suspect that if you just do it, you will experience God's grace in it and know that the Sabbath was made for us. Thanks be to God. Amen.